To Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." The Gospel of the Lord. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable unto you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. We had the diocesan convention yesterday. Some of you were there. And our bishop talked about a vertical and a horizontal aspect of the gospel. She was using different quotations and making a different point, but I was struck at how Jesus's words today really have that vertical component and that horizontal component. He's asked, what commandment in the law is the greatest? And he quotes two passages from the Hebrew scriptures. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I at least think of God in a vertical sense. Sometimes in the sort of sense of transcendence. Maybe you also have had some experiences where you felt the glory of God, the transcendence of God. There are few, far between, but they're life-changing. Sometimes they're brought on by beauty. I remember having this sense in a great cathedral when there was beautiful music playing. And I thought I saw a vision of the heavens and the stars and the swirling stars, and I felt the presence of God. Sometimes it's a sense of depth. We're being rooted in God, like the great trees rooted in the earth, a rock, unchanging, a solid place to stand when we are buffeted by life. That's the vertical aspect of God and our relationship to God. And then there's the horizontal. Love your neighbor as yourself. That invites us to look around. Love your neighbor as yourself, it can be so simply expressed. Maybe when you were a child, your parent or someone said to you when you were mean to another child, "Would you like it if Billy did that to you?" Does that sound at all familiar? When I was about 4, my little brother Paul was about 2, but he was a very healthy and active child, and I, although my parents didn't know it, was suffering from a thyroid deficiency, and so he was actually sort of more vigorous than I was, and he used to bite me. And one of the family stories is that at one point my mother held him down and told me to bite him. And he looked up wonderingly and said, "Jamie bit me." I'm sure that she followed up with, "And you didn't like that very much, did you? So maybe you shouldn't bite Jamie." Much of the problems of the world perhaps could be solved if someone had really enforced on certain people when they were children that other people's feelings matter just as much as theirs do. But although in its simplest form it's easy to say and we learn it at our parents' knee, in another way, this is a lifetime of work. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, how do you love yourself? I heard a podcast recently about someone who describes himself as a recovering perfectionist and talked about that harsh voice inside him if he does something less than perfectly. Maybe you have a harsh voice inside you. And maybe sometimes you turn that harsh voice on someone else that you love too, because it makes you too anxious to recognize your frailty and imperfection or their frailty and imperfection. Maybe you're a full adult when you discover that that harsh voice inside you isn't to be trusted. Maybe that's news to you today, that you don't have to rely on beating yourself up in order to do your best or to do good enough. You can be gentle with yourself and gentle with the people around you. Sometimes the struggle to love yourself and love your neighbor has to do with a lifetime work of forgiveness. Because sometimes people do great wrong. Sometimes tragedy has happened. Sometimes abuse has happened. It might be something that your lifetime is spent learning to forgive, to let that go. How do these two things fit together? Loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. I suggest that the time that we spend in conscious relationship with God, those transcendent moments, those times when we recognize our anchor in the unchanging God, it's like we can let go of the friction, the inevitable friction caused by life and interaction with other people. It's like the reboot on the computer. It's a time when God sort of gets inside us and makes new connections and reconfigures things. Yes, we can tell ourselves, love neighbor as self. But how do we live a life that allows us to actually do that without taking that time to connect with the loving and permanent, eternal God, with our Creator. Church has both the vertical and the horizontal components built in. On the one hand, church invites us into relationship with other people, sometimes people who are annoying. Oh, no one here. But I have to admit, during the convention, there was a certain amount of friction at times. There was a certain amount of annoyance as we tried to connect to Zoom. Church is maybe one of the, maybe the only social group in our society where, everyone is welcome. You don't have to have money to buy things. We don't have a membership thing. It's not like a society where we all vote on whether to admit someone or not. It's just a collection of people that God has brought together in one place. Sometimes for a long time, sometimes people passing through. It's a place to practice being a neighbor. But the more important aspect of church, I believe, is that vertical relationship. If we think of ourselves as having a relationship with God, think about how you maintain a relationship with a person. Marriage therapists say if you want to keep your marriage strong, you should spend at least about 20 minutes a day listening to each other. In the morning, ask each other, what are your plans for the day, and actually listen, take turns. In the evening, each person gets a little time to sort of share. It might be a small little victory, it might be a frustration, it might be, something that's probably not that interesting, but you listen because you love this person. And then about once a week, they say, you should take time to go on a date. Set some time apart when you're not on your phone, you're not watching TV, you're not reading a book, you're not doing the dishes, you're just paying attention to each other. That's what church is in our relationship with God. It's a time during the week that we say, okay, this time I'm going to spend paying attention to God. I'm going to listen to scripture about people's record of their relationship with God. I'm going to sing hymns using my voice to express my love for God. I'm going to take some time in silence and prayer. And maybe I will have an insight. Maybe I won't, but I will have spent that time just paying attention to that relationship with God, using my heart, my mind, and my soul to pay attention to God, my Creator and Father. And from that practice, I believe that we are renewed then in being centered in that relationship with God. That centering, that rootedness, then gives us a place to stand as we reach out to our neighbor. Gives us the patience to listen to them. Gives us the sense of God's abundance from which we share generously with others. Love God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's the center of a God-centered life. It's the center of a life of compassion. It's the center of a Christ-like life.